We're live.
We're live! Hello, everyone.
Super.
Just give everyone a minute to join.
Indeed.
Talk amongst ourselves.
There's some people in the chat pouring whiskey already.
Excellent. Good. That's what we need.
Sounds well. Super.
Okay. Should we get going?
We can get going. I've had a thumbs up from the producer.
Well, first of all, introductions. Hello, everybody. I'm Annabel. I am the CEO and founder of Nc'nean.
And I'm Matt. I'm the blender and brand ambassador and photographer and videographer and a million other things for Nc'nean.
And also in the room, although you can't see her, is Sasha, who is our head of marketing, but today moonlighting as our producer. So first of all, and most importantly, please pour yourselves a whiskey. No one wants to not be drinking whiskey on a Tuesday night, especially when you're going to have to hear us talk about whiskey. Secondly, what we're going to do today. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of an intro to Nc'nean and how we ended up on this fun and crazy journey. Then Matt is going to take you through two whiskies. Firstly, Nc'nean Organic and how we make that and some of the philosophy behind it. And then Huntress 2023, which has just been released. It's live in the UK and will be going live in some of our other markets over the next couple of weeks. And then finally, at the end, we will have time for questions. So please share comments and questions as we go. We love to hear your feedback and your thoughts. And Sasha is going to collate your questions and we will answer them live at the end.
Perfect.
So hopefully you've all got whiskey. And let me tell you a little bit about how Nc'nean came to be. Some of you may know some of this already, but for those of you who are completely new to Nc'nean, I started life as a management consultant in the City of London 10 years ago now. And the journey to creating Nc'nean started as a family idea. So it's on my family's farm on the west coast of Scotland, and it was this idea we talk about around the dining room table. We dreamt about it a lot. We didn't really do much about it. And I had the opportunity to take some time off work in 2012, and I thought, well, I offered to my family, I'll write the business plan, because unless we actually do something about this, it's never going to become a reality. So I decided I'd take a trip to Islay to do some research. Terribly hard work, but someone had to do it. And it was really on Islay that I guess came away with this feeling that there was a really important role for a distillery in Scotland to push and champion sustainability, and also have the freedom as a new distillery to be much more kind of creative in the way that we make our spirits. And that is very much going to be the theme of our tasting tonight with Huntress. Huntress 2023 is a long way from that point. First of all, I had to write the business plan, and that really focused on kind of sustainability. So I wrote the business plan. I went back to my previous job and I thought, this is all going to be easy. My father and I thought we can hold down full-time jobs whilst somehow raising all the money and building a distillery. And by mid-2013, it became clear that this was not going to happen. And I had been looking to leave my previous job anyway, and I thought, well, when else am I going to get the opportunity to start a distillery? So I went out for dinner with my other half and handed in my notice the next day. So there started Nc'nean. We then spent 2 years fundraising, which was tough. Raising £7.5 million from a bit of paper is not an easy thing to do, but we got there. And by mid-2015, we were ready to start building. And this really became me as a management consultant's worst nightmare, because as some of you may know, what management consultants are not very good is actually doing the plans they write. And suddenly I was responsible for actually putting into place this plan that I had written. And so what did this plan look like? And I guess what I'll do now is talk about kind of sustainability and some more of that background, and then I'll leave Matt to talk about some of the liquid and really how we develop the whiskey itself. But from a sustainability side, it is my view that any modern whiskey or any modern business, frankly, it is incumbent upon them to start as sustainably as they possibly can. We had the privilege of starting from a completely blank sheet of paper. And whilst back in 2013, 2015, sustainability was definitely not the buzzword that it is today, it was quite clear to me at that point that the world already faced a crisis and that we had the opportunity to operate in a much more sustainable way. So in that initial phase of building, we tried to tackle what I saw as the four major issues, and that was the beginning of our sustainability journey. I always say to people, we are by no means perfect, and we as a company are very much still on that journey. But the four things that I wanted to tackle to begin with were energy, raw materials, water and waste. So energy is obviously very important. Distilling takes a lot of energy. And for Nc'nean, that means biomass. So sustainability is very much about what is sustainable where you are. And we are in a very, very remote bit of the west coast of Scotland. Most people don't believe how remote they are until they get there. And then they say, oh my God, you're really remote. But we are lucky enough to have a commercial forest basically on site. So I decided that biomass was absolutely the right thing to do. We harvest the wood ourselves. We dry it in the forest. Our distillers are also wood chippers. They go and get the wood, the wood 3 times a week and chip it themselves. And we replant every single tree that we harvest. So that was the solution for energy. Then the question is raw materials. So barley is obviously the key ingredient to whiskey. And I felt that it was very important that we looked after the land on which the barley was grown as much as we were trying to do the right thing on our own distillery site. So we have always chosen to buy organic Scottish barley. And that will always be the case for Nc'nean. So we currently work with 2 Scottish organic farmers who tend to be further on the East Coast, which is a kind of better barley growing environment. And we try to work closely with them, both, of course, on quality, but also on reducing their environmental impact. And I think the amazing thing about organic is it's not only brilliant for the biodiversity, the water quality on the farm site, and also better generally for the carbon footprint, but we think it brings a lovely texture and oiliness to the whiskey, which I'm sure Matt will touch on.
Definitely.
And then water and waste. Water and waste, they're the kind of unglamorous bits, but they're really important. For water, we have a very basic but quite unusual pond for our cooling system.
Innovative cooling system.
Exactly.
Really big pond.
Exactly. If I like to sell, sometimes we call it our closed loop cooling system, but really it is just a pond. This really freaked the engineers out when we were putting it in place because felt like they couldn't measure the heat loss that we were going to generate from it. But it's a very simple system. Warm water from our condensers goes in one end, cold water comes out the other, and this is what creates our condensate or liquid at the end of our distillation process. And finally, waste. Now, waste, we've actually gone for a very traditional approach. We're on a farm, and our cows eat the leftover draff, i.e. the solid parts from the malted barley, and we spread our liquid effluent, which is called pot ale, on the fields as a light fertiliser. Again, we have those both available for us where we are, and it doesn't make any sense, given our location, to take stuff off-site. And that was the beginning of the journey. So by 2017, we'd built the distillery with all of those things in place, and we started distilling. You then obviously have 3 years to relax, go on holiday, obviously not what happened at all. And by 2020, we had our whiskey out. So just before I hand over to Matt to talk about that, I'm going to explain Nc'nean, the name, because we get asked this a lot. And when we were starting, I really wanted to find a name that represented what we stood for, rather than just being the name of the place, for example. And we looked back in Scottish history and found this amazing goddess called Nc'nean, who was known as a protector of nature and for walking her own path. And we thought that so perfectly summed up everything we stood for that I wanted to somehow name the distillery after her. But Nc'nean has 13 letters, very few vowels, and I did not want to type that out 15 times a day. So we shortened it to Nc'nean. And fun fact for you, Nuc is the female equivalent of Muck. So Muck means son of, so MacDonald, son of Donald, and Nuc means daughter of.
Which is very handy for a female-founded, predominantly female-run distillery.
Exactly, exactly. And so, without further ado, should we talk about the whiskey?
Let's drink some liquid.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So, first round, if you have it, pour for yourself. Is Nc'nean Organic, the sort of our core whiskey, the thing that we always have available year round. We've relatively recently changed the recipe a little bit, a little tweak, as we continue to develop and grow as a distillery. So if you've got anything that's sort of batch and then a number after it, batch 1 through to 18, it will be our original recipe, which is 65% STR red wine casks, 35% bourbon casks. I'll go into the nitty-gritty of those details in a second. But if you have something that's a little bit more recent, it will say batch and then 2 letters and 2 numbers. So it could be B06 or 8, or a few others that we've put in there. Secret code, if anyone can figure it out, they get what? They get
Free whole cask of whiskey.
I get a cask of whiskey if you figure out what the code system is. And that's the updated recipe. So it now has incorporated some traditional sherry butts into the mix as well. The new recipe is 55% STR red wine casks, which are my shuffling. No.
You shouldn't.
Oh, okay. Sorry, notes from
I'm meant to be doing this. I'm your camera assistant. Failing in my basic duties. Here we go, the bottle.
So 55% STR red wine casks, that's shaved, toasted, and recharred red wine casks. We take 5 to 7 year old Spanish Portuguese red wine casks, shave 2 millimeters off the inside, toast and rechar them, and that process not only rejuvenates the oak, so you have a fresh layer for maturation, which is very impactful. It also caramelizes any of the residual wine sugars that are left in the staves, and those compounds are quite heavy, they're quite rich, and they fall into solution really easily, so we get a lot of movement from those casks at a young age. And it's things like that breadiness, the toffee, the more jammy fruits. It's a lot of the depth of our whiskey. Then it's 43% American whiskey casks. It's predominantly first fill ex-bourbon, which is pretty standard across Scotland. There are some second fill casks in there as well, which are my personal favourite. They're much more distillery profile forward, so we get more citrus, more cleanliness. It's very bright and clean. And then the last 2%, the new inclusion are these traditional sherry butts. So we've always filled sherry butts from, I say day one, from whenever we first filled the sherry butts, sometime in 2017. Year one. And these are big 500 litre casks, so they're over double the size of these normal casks. They take a little bit longer to develop because of that. There's less wood to liquid ratio, so they just take a little bit more time to mature, which is why we've only just started including them in the recipe. And it's just 2% because it's more like seasoning. Our whiskey's not meant to taste like a big sherry cask whiskey. The sherry cask elements are there. It's like salt and pepper. It rounds out the other flavours. It brings everything else together and creates a more kind of cohesive whiskey. On the whiskey itself, we aim for accessibility. We're trying to make something that is very light, bright, fruity, clean, broadly appealing, enjoyable for most palates, flavours that people can really enjoy with any kind of level of experience in whiskey as it is. The things that we do differently at Nc'nean and why I'm so passionate about our spirit, the big difference is, one, we are completely organic, as Annabel mentioned. Only using 100% organic Scottish barley. There's lots of sustainable credentials from that. From a liquid perspective, I do fundamentally believe it makes a difference. We've never done anything non-organic, so I wouldn't be able to tell you for a fact if it does, but the theory behind it, the science behind it, is that this organically grown barley has a wider range of nutrients. If you're using commercially farmed barley, it's the same fertilizer that's gone into the ground, and therefore it's the same nutrients that end up in the barley. Along with the sugars, this is what yeast eats to make flavour and make alcohol. And the more interesting things that the yeast eats, the more complicated things it produces on the other side. So we get this broader range of flavours. For us, it's a load more fruitiness and a load more creaminess, a load more texture. Anecdotally, from other distilleries that we've tasted, side by side, sort of organic and non-organic spirit. The organic spirit always tends to be fuller, richer, creamier, more texture, longer finish. And it's down to yeast having just more interesting things to eat.
And I think you can see this from other things that are grown organically.
Yeah,
they tend to have more intense flavours, and I think that translates through our barley into the whiskey.
Yeah, certainly. So that's the first big difference for our distillery. Next is in fermentation and playing around with yeast. So we run very, very long fermentation times for Scotland. The norm is 50, 55 hours. We run 2 sessions per week at 68 and 3 at 114. Which in terms of flavour just means it's more time for yeast to produce more interesting things. So we're getting more of those juicy fruit flavours, more of our fermentation flavours, more of those fats, oils, texture, weight, viscosity. We then run what's referred to as a tight high cut in the still. I don't know how geeky I can get here, but if you think of everything that comes off of the still as like a spectrum of flavour, that full kind of rainbow, we're only taking those first 3 or 4 colours rather than the full gamut, which means we're only getting the clean, citrusy, bright, fresh flavours. We're not getting so much of the heavier, leathery, oily, earthy flavours from our spirits.
Before we go on, can you just go back over the cask makeup for the new batches?
Because... Oh, of course I can. Yeah, no problem. So it's now 55% STR red wine, so just over half of those reconditioned red wine casks, which is breadiness, juicy fruits, jammy fruits. And then it's 43% the American whiskey casks, which is more distillery profile, but you're going to get some vanilla, some coconut, just bright, sweet, toffee kind of flavors from that. And then the last 2% are the sherry butts. And if you taste them on their own, it's a sherry cask whiskey. They're very rich, they're very decadent, they're very gouty. Just like really over the top dried fruits and richness and sweetness. But the way they're used in the whiskey, it works like seasoning. It's the liquid equivalent I can think of is like using Angelica to make gin, which is not the most accessible of analogies. But the Angelica is there not as a flavour itself, but as a binder, as a way of making all the other flavours make sense.
And by the way, if you ever want to know, not while we're doing live tasting, what goes into the whiskey from Nc'nean that you have in your hand, it is all on our website. So we have a batch page on our website, and it is all visible there.
Which our lovely producer has just shared.
There we go. All singing from the same hymn sheet.
Yeah. It's something that I'm very happy that we do at Nc'nean as well. We're very transparent as to what goes into and makes up our spirit, because we need to be. It's interesting information for you, but we've also got nothing to hide. We're very proud of what we do and what we make. So yes, we should probably drink some.
Yeah, I've been getting going already.
So yeah, the resulting liquid for me is very just bright and fresh, and the most striking element I find is the finish. Considering we've got this very light, clean style of whiskey, we have an exceptionally long finish, and it's all down to those long chain esters that we make in fermentation, the way that we generate texture and weight and viscosity. These compounds they're stuck to your tongue and they drag all the other flavours along for the ride. And
I think our philosophy has always been to try and create the most delicious spirit possible. And then by excellent casks to mature it in. But fundamentally, if you start with a fantastic spirit before you even put it into casks, you're going to end up with a great whiskey.
Exactly. Perfect. I think that broadly covers core whiskey.
Yeah.
Should we taste the special one?
Let's. So we are here, just pour into mine. We are here to talk really about Huntress Woodland Candy, which is our 2023 Huntress release. It is in a lovely blue bottle like this.
Thank you so much. So the Huntress series, well, the Nc'nean special releases in general. So like I said, we have the core whiskey available year round, all the time, and then every year we'll do a spring seasonal release and an autumn seasonal release. The autumn one is our Quiet Rebels series, which focuses on the individual people that work and make Nc'nean, and I sit down and make whiskey with them for them. It's probably the most fun I get to have every year, discovering what someone loves in whiskey and then trying to recreate that in what we do. But the Huntress series is much more experimental, and it's testing what's possible within the rules of the SWA and what you can legally call and make as single malt Scotch whiskey. How can you develop new flavours in such a well-trodden path? And whilst the industry as a whole has been very, very good at playing around with casks and sort of the end of the whiskey making process, historically there's not been a lot of experimentation in the early stages. Anything that might affect yield has sort of been pushed alongside, but we're not too fussed on yield. We're not trying to make as much alcohol as possible. We're trying to make the best, most interesting spirits possible. So for us, playing around with barley, playing around with yeast, playing around with fermentation is a really fun and interesting way, if not it's like longer way of making and creating interesting new flavours in Scotch whisky. So the Huntress series so far has all been about fermentation experiments and what we can do at those early stages to change the character of our spirits. In 2022, we released the first of those, which was a 3 yeast recipe. So I didn't cover this earlier, but unusually we use 2 yeasts in tandem at Nc'nean. So we have like a high strength distiller's yeast that makes lots of alcohol and traditional Scotch whisky flavours. And then we also have a high ester yeast, which makes more of those fruity compounds and fatty compounds that we love in our spirit. For that first release, it was a 3 yeast recipe with those first 2, plus an additional, very romantically named Distillamax RM, which is a rum yeast. That's a yeast that was isolated and then used traditionally to make Martinique-style rum, so fresh sugarcane juice rums. And its inclusion, obviously, it's a new yeast that's eating those same compounds but producing new and interesting things. So it made the whiskey, much more mineral for me, way more like stone, concrete, petrichor, a bit more salinous as well, so a bit more salty. And then the fruits had shifted to be a bit more tropical, fresh and bright. This year, to continue the trend, we've gone for a 4 yeast recipe. It's came about in a slightly unusual way. So we run these yeast trials every year. It's about a 3-week period every year. And there'll be 2 or 3 different recipes that we'll run in that time. In 2017, we ran 2 different recipes. One of them was a white wine yeast that was delicious, but very bright, very top note, very clean, with not a lot of depth and complexity to it. And then in 2018, along with the rum yeast trial that we ran, we also ran a red wine yeast trial. And that spirit was much heavier, funkier, earthy, really very, very rich for Nc'nean, and certainly comparative to the normal spirit that we run. Because that's the only element of production that we changed. It's the same barley going in, it's the same production times and the same cut points. Everything's identical apart from a little bit of the yeast recipe has been switched out and we've added something new. And again, the whiskey, interesting on its own, delicious on its own, but not fully rounded, not complete whiskey that I'd be happy releasing. But handily, when you've got a very light whiskey and a very heavy whiskey and you combine them, you create this wonderful balance of an interesting spirit. So it's got those light, bright, clean notes. It's got a little bit of depth and complexity and just funk and character about it. And then we've mixed that in with just a little bit of our normal stock. I think it's 2 or 3 casks of the 2 yeast recipe, resulting in, is it 10 or 12 casks? I can't remember. But a small batch of this very unique, interesting take on the Nc'nean spirit. It's probably the most whiskey lover whiskey that we've made so far, because it's got, even though it's still bright and clean, it's got so much more complexity and richness and that kind of grimy funk that, that a lot of the whiskey crowd really like.
Indeed. Hence the name Woodland Candy.
Indeed,
and we
yes.
wanted to introduce something this year which we haven't done in previous years, which really alludes to the kind of flavour emphasis of this series, which is really what it's all about. And the reason we do Huntress is to showcase to the world in very small quantities, it must be said, our kind of exploration of flavour and hunting for new things that create flavour in whiskey distilling. And it was really these kind of opportunities around yeast that got me so excited when I went to Islay, because I drank a lot of craft beer and kind of I saw a lot of craft beer of people talking about yeast, but no one in distilling seemed to care about it. Every distiller I went to didn't even mention yeast. And then when you look into it, you find a lot of the big distilleries are all using one mass-produced yeast across all sites. And that seemed crazy to me, because fundamentally we're beer brewers who happen to distill, and all of that flavour creation really happens in the beer end of the process. So
yeah, I mean, when you're making whiskey, you've only got those kind of 4 variables of water, barley, yeast, and casks. And
let's be honest, the water doesn't make
really make any difference. The barley makes a good amount of difference, and we're seeing some experiments with other people doing work in that field, which is delightful. But the bulk of Scotland is always focused on what can we do with casks, how can we play around and create flavour that way, which is a great way of making whiskey, and we do it ourselves. But there's so much potential in yeast, so much of the flavour that you're tasting when you've got a glass of single malt Scotch in front of you comes from fermentation, comes from yeast. And especially if you're focused on that and you're trying to create great spirit that is kind of ester heavy and rich, that's the area that you want to be playing around with, because it's untapped and there's so much potential. There are thousands of strains of yeast that could potentially produce new and interesting and exciting flavours. Just need to test it and do it, which we're doing.
Exactly. And here is the product. So tell us about the tasting notes of this, Matt.
Okay. For me, there's one that we can't say for copyright reasons, but think of the hard toffee candies that your granddad eats. It's a very, very creamy toffee, Maillard, sweet, rich, sweet complexity. It's almost molasses-esque, but much creamier, much brighter. And then there's a lot more, what we say, woodland candy, kind of undergrowth. Sweet roots like licorice and angelica, and just more earth, more, it's almost marmitey, kind of meaty addition of richness and complexity that's paired very, very nicely into our into our style. They're not flavours that I'd associate with Nc'nean at all, but they've balanced really, really well when mixed with because all that's come from the red wine yeast experiment. So that white wine yeast has helped sort of soften the edges of that complexity, so it's not too marmitey and divisive.
But I do love the really sweet notes on it.
Mm.
I mean, I think candy just sums it up perfectly.
Candy, definitely, yeah. Right, so
the other thing I love about it, by the way, is that when we were making the film for this release, we could literally walk 50 metres down the hill from the distillery. And there we were, woodlands.
We're in woodland candy territory.
It's something that is so special about that particular area of Scotland that we're in, because most of Scotland is devoid of trees.
Yeah.
But on Morven, which is the peninsula that we're on, it's like a really unique area for lots of very ancient native woodland, which is a very special thing from a biodiversity and sustainability point of view in Scotland. So I think it nicely ties back to that environment as well.
It does, and it's fertile land for flavour. We have Claire, our local forager, that can produce a meal of any description all year round, thanks to the bounty of our land. And
Exactly.
we harvest some of that stuff ourselves, like the bog myrtle, the heather, the sorrel and thyme that go into our botanical spirit. That's all harvested by the hard-working distillery team. You have to down tools every season, go pick sorrel and dry it under our still. But woodland candy is a really nice allude to that, to the bounty of our peninsula.
Do you want to tell us a little bit more about? Well, do you want to tell us anything more about Huntress, or should we talk a bit about the other yeast experiments we have hiding in the warehouse?
Gosh, we have a lot of yeast experiments hiding in the warehouse.
Just pick a few of the highlights.
So the year after the trials that we've released so far, in 2019, we did a collaboration with Spheric Spirits, who are another producer who were very focused on fermentation and innovative new flavours. That was a Pachia yeast, which I still don't know too much about, but it's a super interesting spirit.
Yeah.
It tastes like cola cubes. So again, very sweet and medicinal, but that's in a very candied, saccharine sugar kind of way. And then since I've joined, and I've had a little bit of input into the yeast varieties, which is really nice. So recently we've been working a lot with different brewers' yeasts. So the Kveik is, I think, my favourite. Kveik is a Norwegian ale house yeast. It's something that they use to make kind of hazy beers in Norway, and it's when you read like the tasting notes on the yeast sheet, it's Nc'nean. It's everything that we aim for. It's hyper fruity. It's hyper creamy. It's very fast fermenting and clear fermenting, which is really, really useful for us in developing the flavours that we want further down the production line. When we did the bucket trials, and they are bucket trials, they're buckets with yeast and washing to test to see if they're viable. We also had a little taste to see what kind of flavours we might expect. And the Kveik tasted almost exactly like orange barley squash, which was so delicious. Such a weird throwback of tasting something fermented and reminding you of your childhood and this squash your mum gave me. But I can't wait to see the spirit that's been created from that, because that was so creamy, so fresh, so citrusy, and that's going to be a more Nc'nean than anything we've ever released, which would be really, really good fun. But there's I could go on. There's so many kicking about in the warehouse.
Exactly, exciting things to come.
Definitely. Super. Should we answer some questions?
Yeah, let's do that. Sasha,
Hi.
piece us up.
Hi from the other side of the camera. We've got someone just asking a factual question, which is how many bottles are there in Woodland Candy?
There are 4,556.
And they go all across Europe at the moment.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
yeah. Do you want to talk about, I think there's some left on our website. There's a few left on
Yes,
there.
there are some left on our website. It hasn't even made it to shops in Germany yet, but it should all be physically in Europe with our distributors. Whether it has actually made it into shops or yet is a little bit out of our control. But if you go to our website, you can find a list of all of our distributors by country. So, and some places to buy them, or at least a contact details for our distributors. If you're in the UK, you can buy from our website or your favourite local spirits merchant.
Indeed. While we're answering these questions, by the way, if anyone wants to put some tasty notes in the chat, and we can have a little read of those.
Love to see them.
Yeah, we've had a few in agreement that the name is spot on. There's a group tasting at Lost Close, and they've said they all agree that Woodland Candy is spot on name, which is really nice to hear. And some people getting a bit more woodland than candy, which is interesting. And just a lot of nice comments on massive decision to quit your job and start a distillery.
It didn't feel as massive at the time, I'm going to admit that. I don't think I still thought I'd be doing it 10 years later. I have no idea what I thought I would be doing or who would be running the company. But that's not the point. I think if you know how these things are going to go, you never do it in the first place. So
we've got quite an interesting question, the latest one from Andrew, that is there anything other than red wine casks on experimentation, such as rum casks or white wine casks, etc.? So where is the yeast experiment then going into a cask?
So we don't put any of the yeast trial stock into unusual casks as of yet. We certainly could do in the future. But at the moment, we're kind of still in the experimentation phase, and you want to reduce variables, I think, is the best way of putting it. It can get very complicated if we start mixing it up. But we do have other cask varieties in the warehouse. It's only a small proportion, but we already don't make a lot of spirit in general, so there's not a lot of liquid that I can play with. But we do have some interesting casks in the warehouse. We've already released a few of them in different single casks and in the Quiet Rebel series. So we've had tequila and Tokai and Pinot de Charente, the Reef Salt cask that we just did with Annabel, which was just divine. So delicious. We've had a delivery recently of some French white wine, some Madeira.
We've got Calvados, rum, rye.
Rum from an English rum producer, which is absolutely fantastic, real funky and rich.
Lots is the answer. Lots of interesting casks in the warehouse, but as Matt said, we try not to mix it with the yeast experiments, because for us to see the impact of the yeast, and hopefully for you all as well, is the kind of interesting bit of it. So.
We've got Andrew, the same chap, asking if he can sample and comment, which is interesting because when we did our first ever release called Nc'nean, we actually did get our kind of early days Nc'nean fans to help us choose what was going to be released. So that's a good suggestion, Andrew. Maybe we put that back in the bag for future, because it was a clear winner when we did 2 different cask samples. So
great idea.
If you don't already, any plans for a cask strength release?
Maybe. But I'll say no more.
We did have a cask strength release, which was the same release I was just talking about, which was Nc'nean. But since then, we have
a lot of our single casks are cask strength. Not all of them, but a lot of them are.
Yeah.
And there may be something else in the pipeline.
Could be delicious.
Another question: can you repeat the quantities delivered by the standard 2 yeast Anchor and Fermentus? I think maybe in the core.
So
qualities delivered. Sorry,
the qualities from the different yeasts.
Yes.
Yeah, of course. So Anchor is the distiller's yeast. It's not dissimilar to M, which is the main yeast that's used across almost every distillery in Scotland. Just slight variances, but what you're getting from that is high ethyl alcohol. That's the main thing. That's what you want as a distiller. Flavour-wise, it's more traditional single malt Scotch whisky flavours, which I associate with furrow and stuff. So it's caramel and malt and what you normally expect when you pick up a glass of single malt Scotch whisky. We co-pitch these 50-50. So we pitch the first one, we wait an hour for the temperature to drop, and then we pitch the second one. The second yeast is Fermentus, and Fermentus is a high ester yielding yeast. So we do get alcohol from it, obviously, just not quite to the levels of the Anchor. And the main difference in flavour is you get more mid and long chain esters. Mid chain esters are your juicy fruits. So when we're saying we're tasting peaches and apricots, those kind of flavours, that's all come from fermentation, and we get higher levels of those compounds because of the way we ferment. And then the long chain esters, long chain fatty acid esters, are texture. So it's anything over 14 carbons long, if you're interested. But it is oil.
Which I'm not.
No, you're not. But they are oils. So they are texture and weight and viscosity. It's why we bottle everything over 46%, because we'll never chill filtration removes those compounds. That's its entire goal. They would cause hazing if you bottle the whiskey at a lower ABV, so it might look a little bit cloudy on a shelf. We prefer the drinking strength at 46 plus, so we're never going to bottle it below that anyway. But we won't get hazing by bottling at 46 plus, and it means we retain that texture and that weight, which is it's fundamentally important to Nc'nean. Nc'nean wouldn't be the same whiskey if we chill filtered.
And the other reason it's important is because one of our favourite ways to drink whiskey is with soda over ice. And if you're going to add soda, our suggestion is in proportions of 2 to 4, 2 whiskey, 4 soda. But having that texture and viscosity really helps the whiskey stand up to that dilution and makes an absolutely fantastic drink, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, really fluffy and fresh and clean.
Exactly.
Generates a lot of texture that way.
We've got some more questions coming in. So last year we had a big lecture on terroir. How much of that is influenced by you or the barley brewer? So I think,
well, does that mean does terroir matter?
I think so. How much of that is influenced by you or the barley grower? So I don't know whether
we do. So from a production perspective, we listen to our farmers. The farmers know their land better than everybody else. When we're picking varietals or
we're not picking varietals.
we don't. We talk to the farmer, and the farmer says Laureate or Concerto will grow best this year.
And that is particularly important in organic, by the way, because so you don't have any of the luxury of fertilizers or pesticides in organic. And so the variety that our farmers choose to use has to be able to withstand and grow well in the conditions that they've got. And so it is an incredibly important choice. And this is actually, the farmer doesn't even make it on their own. They make it in kind of collaboration with an advisor, generally as part of the maltsters. We are not farming experts, so we don't get at all involved in that. But what we do, because we're really interested, is record everything.
Yes.
So for anyone, if you really want to know, for anyone batch of whiskey, we could tell you what barley variety it went into and what farms, or in the future, single farm it had come from. So as of Jan 2022, we started distilling single farm barley, not because we have a massive interest in kind of showcasing that terroir. More from a practical point of view, we moved to a maltster that was close by so we could reduce our carbon footprint. We wanted to reduce the number of farmers we work with so that we could work with them more closely. And this maltster were able to supply us with single farm batches of barley. But it's kind of cool as well. It will be interesting in the future to see if they turn out differently. Maybe one of the Huntresses in 4 years' time will be a single farm edition. But it is not kind of, we don't consider that, I guess, fundamental to what we do in the flavour creation and what we're trying to explore.
Yet.
I'm going to pick 2 more questions out of the few more we've got, and then I can always answer some in the chat. So we have got one that's not related to this so much, but could you choose anywhere more remote? And does the lack of Corran Ferry affect you at the moment?
I think we could choose somewhere more remote, but it would be hard.
Yeah.
And inadvisable. And yes, the lack of Corran Ferry is not ideal. It's causing us massive problem for deliveries because simple practical things like lorry drivers can only spend a certain time driving. And if they've got to take an extra hour and a half to get around the end of the loch, it is a problem. So for those of you that are not so familiar with the geography of the west coast of Scotland, we are on a peninsula, we're not on an island, but by far the quickest way to get to us is by ferry. Said ferry has been operating on a backup ferry since November, and the backup ferry gave up the ghost about 2 weeks ago. So we now have no ferry. There is a road link round, which is what everyone's reliant on, but adds about an hour and a half to the journey. Each way, exactly. So Matt and I will be there in 2 weeks, and we're going to have the pain of that journey.
Oh yes, can't wait.
But the ferry is scheduled to be back on at the beginning of June, I think. So we are all very much looking forward to that.
And final question before we wrap things up. Why did you change the batch system to the code system? And is the code system a secret?
Well, the code system is a secret, yes. And as we said earlier in the tasting, if you can work out the code system, then you win a cask of whiskey, we decided.
Exactly.
We changed the system, just the numeric system, I don't think worked for us in the long run. Once when we got to 18 and looking forward, we could see like, one, we're releasing small batches and we wanted to release larger batches. So there was going to be a change there anyway. Having a nice divide between the original kind of 5,000 bottle batches and the new 11,000 bottle batches seemed like a really nice idea.
And that was when we changed the recipe as well. So it gives people a clear indication on the bottle whether you're buying the original recipe or the evolved recipe. And yeah, we didn't really fancy getting to batch 201.
Yeah.
And also 18 is the legal drinking age. So it felt like a nice time to change. And that's it, really.
Yeah.
And the three of us in the room here are the only three people that know what that batch system is. The rest of the team, much to their
Are
disappointment,
so angry with me.
don't know what it is.
But yeah, we've said that if anyone figures out what that code system is before we change it, it's quite a way before we change it yet, then they can have a cask of whiskey, which will be fun.
So keep plugging away, everyone.
Cool. Well, I think that's us then.
That's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. It's been great fun. I hope you've all enjoyed Woodland Candy. We've certainly really enjoyed having you here. And until we meet in person, slash.
As well.